Well, good evening and welcome to our webinar, Essential Conversations, the Sin of Christian Nationalism. I'm Patrick Cheng and I'll be your moderator for tonight's event, which is co-sponsored by the Cairo Center and Church Publishing Incorporated. We are so glad that you are able to join us for this important and timely conversation. And I'm pleased to share that there's been a great deal of interest in this topic. As of this morning, nearly 1,300 people had registered for this webinar. And tonight's webinar also marks the publication of an important new book, The Crisis of Christian Nationalism, a report from the House of Bishops Theology Committee. This book is co-edited by Bishop Alan Shin and Bishop Larry Benfield, and it also contains a foreword by Presiding Bishop Michael Curry. The book also contains a discussion guide as well as a Spanish translation of the text. For me, one of the most powerful lines from the report is this: the committee calls the Episcopal Church to stand against Christian nationalism, the gravest and most dangerous sin today. Let me say that again. The committee calls the Episcopal Church to stand against Christian nationalism, the gravest and most dangerous sin today. And I really look forward to unpacking the statement with you and with our four distinguished panelists during the course of the next 2 hours. As I mentioned, I'm Patrick Cheng, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's webinar. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and I serve as the visiting professor of Anglican Studies at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And I'm also the co-convener of the Diocese of New York's Theology Committee. Let me just say a few words about the structure of tonight's webinar. We will begin with a 10-minute reflection or thereabouts from each of our four panelists on why it is so important for all of us to address the crisis of Christian nationalism right now, particularly given this time in our nation's history. We will then have 3 rounds of follow-up questions to the panelists, and our program will end with a Q&A session. As such, please submit your questions to the Zoom question box. The chat box won't work in terms of the questions, so please put that there. And there's no reason why you have to wait until the end of the session. Just put them in as you have questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So I'd like to now introduce Ardea Stewart, the publisher of Church Publishing and Senior Vice President at the Church Pension Group. Ardea will say a few words about the publication of The Crisis of Christian Nationalism. Ardea.
Thank you, Patrick. It's my pleasure to join you today from Frankfurt, where the annual International Book Fair takes place, where publishers gather to highlight their content. And it is especially palpable that books matter in the conversations they can begin. They can help to shape dialogue, they can open minds, they can highlight the world's most pressing problems and deliver insights on a path forward. It seems so fitting to be here to welcome you all to Essential Conversations, the Sin of Christian Nationalism, a webinar born of the Crisis of Christian Nationalism, the important work from the House of Bishops Theology Committee, published this month by Church Publishing in a bilingual edition with a guide for discussion. Of this work, Michael Curry said, it offers both profound and practical responses to the Christian nationalism that today threatens our country's soul. The study addresses this important issue, which has increasingly come to the forefront of conversations surrounding Christianity, democracy, and white supremacy. When Bishop Shin approached me about the report, I knew immediately that it should be published in book form and made available as soon as possible. Along the publishing chain, we have had powerful and genuine expressions of gratitude about us making the book available and the committee addressing Christian nationalism. Today, in this collaboration between the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice and Church Publishing, you will hear from an esteemed panel about why this complex movement is sin. Dr. Cheng will next introduce our speakers. Thank you again for joining us today and for helping to continue the conversation, encouraging others to read this important work.
Thanks so much, Ardea, and thanks so much for zooming in from Frankfurt, Germany, where it is just after midnight, I believe. So that's a commitment, and also all your work with Church Publishing. I'd like to now introduce our four distinguished panelists before we begin with the initial statements. So first, we have the Very Reverend Canon Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Canon Douglas is the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and the Anglican Communion canon at Newcastle Cathedral in Newcastle, England. Canon Douglas is currently a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School for this academic year. And from 2017 to 2023, she was the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. Now, last year, Canon Douglas was awarded the prestigious Graumeyer Award for her book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. And for those of you that don't know the Graumeyer Award, it's sort of like the Nobel Prize for religious scholarship. So it's a big deal. And Canon Douglas was one of the 6 theologians from the Episcopal Church who worked with the House of Bishops Theology Committee on its new report, The Crisis of Christian Nationalism. And so I'll go ahead and introduce the other panelists. Second, we do have the Right Reverend Matthew Hyde. Bishop Hyde is the 17th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and he was consecrated in May of 2023 and was installed as the Bishop Diocesan in February of this year, succeeding Bishop Andy Dici. Prior to his election as the Bishop of New York, Bishop Hyde served for 10 years as the 10th rector of the Church of the Heavenly Rest on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Bishop Hyde has served in leadership roles with organizations across the entire Episcopal Church, including serving as the board president of the Episcopal Parish Network, which was at one time the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, or SEEP. Bishop Hyde has also served as the board chair of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. And then Bishop Hyde currently serves as the board vice chair of Episcopal Divinity School. Third, we have the Right Reverend Alan Shin. Bishop Shin is the Bishop Suffragan of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and he recently celebrated the 10th anniversary of his consecration as a bishop, which had occurred in 2014 at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And during his nearly 3 decades of ordained ministry, Bishop Shin has served in a variety of contexts, including the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square, the Episcopal Asia America Ministry at the Episcopal Church Center, also known as 815, All Saints Church, Margaret Street in London, and Keble College at Oxford University. Between 2002 and 2005, Bishop Shin pursued postgraduate studies in patristics or early church history at Oxford, and he is currently the chair of the House of Bishops Theology Committee and was the co-editor of The Crisis of Christian Nationalism. Finally, fourth, we have the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Dr. Theoharis is the executive director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, and she also teaches at Union Theological Seminary, where she received her PhD in New Testament and Christian origins. Dr. Theoharis has been organizing amongst poor and low-income communities for 3 decades, and she's also been involved with social justice movements her entire life. And Dr. Theoharis has written or edited 3 books, including We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. And her writing has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and CNN, and on and on. So we're very pleased to have her as part of the panel as well. So thanks to all of you panelists for being here tonight. We are grateful for your presence. And let's begin now with a 10-minute reflection by each of you on why it is so important to address the crisis of Christian nationalism, particularly at this moment of our nation's history. I also invite each of you, each panelist, to share some of your initial reflections about the House of Bishops Theology Committee's report, The Crisis of Christian Nationalism. And so I was thinking, let's start with you, Bishop Shin, given your role as the chair of the House of Bishops Theology Committee and as the co-editor of the Crisis of Christian Nationalism. Bishop Shin?
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's wonderful to have you facilitate this conversation. Thank you for doing this. And I want to thank all the panelists, especially Dr. Liz Theo-Harris of Kairos Center. It's wonderful that you have joined us. Thank you very much. Christian nationalism has not been in my radar or awareness actually very long. It's very recent. I've always known about white nationalist groups and movements, which have been seen, reported occasionally and seen as fringe groups and fringe movements. And it was not until very recently, actually, that these fringe groups with religious right have combined together their forces to really push the agenda of Christian nationalism. And I think that symbolically, of course, there was the January 6th, 2021 was the major incident. But even before that, I guess the real symbolic thing was when then President Donald Trump standing in front of St. John's Episcopal Church across the street from White House, holding the Bible upside down. And that to me is a real symbolic moment, actually, because ironically, holding the Bible upside down, it was like as if he was ready to turn Christianity upside down. And also with the entire nation, the democracy upside down. And it was alarming. It was really an alarming moment for me that church and our own church, Episcopal Church, was being used for that purpose, for the symbol of violence and oppression. So the way it came about actually was in the House of Bishops meeting in March of 2022, because during COVID all along 2020 and 2021 we met online, and we actually met in person in March of 2022. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry called the special meeting, and in that meeting, he asked the Theology Committee to consider taking up the issue of Christian nationalism. And he gave a long speech, almost a sermon, as he tends to do. It was really a poignant moment for me. And at the same time, it was daunting. How do you even begin to approach this complex issue? And so I gathered the bishop members of the Theology Committee immediately that day, and we started talking. What are your thoughts, and how do you think we should do this? And we all agreed that we should take it up. We didn't quite know how we're going to go about doing it, because where do we even start, and what is our methodology and all that. But we knew we needed to do that. So we left it there and parked that. And then I gathered the committee with academic theologians on the whole committee, and had some online meetings in that summer. And then the actual first meeting was actually in the fall of 22. Was a hybrid meeting of people. Some people joining in person and online in Indianapolis. And there we spent a couple of days really having a conversation about this issue. And it turns out that it was actually, we were struggling with it too. We had a lot of conversation about actually the semantics, definitions of each Christian, how is it Christian? And nationalism actually was one definition, one word that we really struggled with. And I thought I was going to lose the committee and fall apart. But in the end, we were able to come back. We were able to come back and begin to approach. And two things that intuitively I knew, and everybody then agreed, was that Christian nationalism has its roots, its foundation in white supremacy, in history, culture, and system of white supremacy, at least in the US, and probably true in Europe as well. So it is a product of colonialism. The other is that, therefore, it's a sin. And we needed to then tackle that issue. How is Christian nationalism a sin? And how do we talk about that? So I brought the committee back together in that very narrow focus, and I said, we are not here to talk about all those other aspects, dimensions of Christian nationalism, political history, social history, and cultural history of it all, because there have been already a lot of books have been written already at that time. But I brought the committee to a focus of it's a theological reflection. We have to give a theological response, one, and even more narrowly, we need to focus on the Anglican tradition and ethos. And that is how we began, and with that focus. It is critically important. The Christian nationalism is, as the report says, I think it is the gravest and the dangerous sin and threat to our nation today. The force, the movement of Christian nationalism is rising and increasing and getting stronger. Partly because I think a lot of people really don't know what it is. They hear the word Christian and it sounds good. They hear the word nationalism, it sounds like patriotism. So it sounds good. So it must be all right. But it is not. The Christian nationalism as a whole, as a concept and ideology, is not Christian. And it is not patriotic. It's none of that. It is an ideology that has co-opted, blatantly co-opted Christian, the label Christianity, Christian, to advance and maintain the white power, white supremacy in the system and culture and the structure of this nation. It is a political ideology, foundationally. It is not a theology at all. As more recent book, Jim Wallace's False White Gospel, he says it is bad theology, it's a bad religion, and it's a dangerous ideology. And he's absolutely right. And then the only way to stand up and combat this is with a true religion and true faith. How do we stand up on the true Christian faith, and how do we talk about patriotism, not nationalism? And so I think this is and some people might find it thin. So it is actually, report itself as a book really is not very long, and it was kind of intentional, but also necessary because we didn't have a lot of time. We only had, it was this little post time of coming out of COVID, and we were all exhausted, and we were dealing with this very complicated issue, but we needed to. We knew that we needed to get it done. It was urgent. We didn't have luxury of 5 years of researching and bringing all these other resources into this book. The assumption is that other people will read other books that are political history, Samuel Perry and Whitehead's book, and Catherine Stewart's power worshippers, and Jim Wallace's False White Gospel, all of the other books that deal with sociological and political history and issues of Christian nationalism. What we really focused on is the theological reflection within the Anglican framework, and staying with that. And it's an accessible book. It's easy to read. You can actually read it within a couple of hours or even less than that. However, I would also say it's subversively dense, because each paragraph in this report actually requires deeper reflection and perhaps even more reading from other resources that are referenced in order to really understand what it is that this report is getting at. I think I've used up most of my time, so I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Bishop Shin, and really appreciate the background to this work. Just wanted to mention before we get to Dr. Theoharis that the numbers keep on rising. We're over 500 participants right now. And so for those of you that came late, if you have questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will have some time at the end of this webinar to address them. So next, Dr. Theoharis, and I just wanted to mention too that I think you have a recent article out in The Nation, right, called Project 2025 is Coming for Your Rights. And so how timely, but let me turn it over to you as to why this is such an important topic and your thoughts about, the report.
Well, thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be amongst this company, and many kudos for putting out this really important and timely book. So I don't think I don't think for the folks that are gathered here that I necessarily need to make this point, but I think as we're seeing, across the country and across the world, Christian nationalism is gaining power. And so it's an important moment for us to actually be taking up this topic and seeing it as sin, as a sin against God. Now, Christian nationalism has Christianity, has a religion in its name, and white Christian nationalism, right there in the middle, smack dab in the middle of it. But I want to suggest that Christian nationalism is actually a political movement, and that the political leaders of this movement, and many of their kind of racist and wealthy benefactors, have been weaponizing the Bible and kind of mythologizing a past that never was in order to try to build and create a future that is unfettered by secularism, by democratic expression, and also by economic regulation. And I think it's really important for us to understand, as the book lays out, how Christian nationalism today is an inheritor of kind of some of the old theologies of colonialization, enslavement, industrial capitalism of the past. But it's also, a modern creation of its own. And as Dr. Cheng mentioned, I think it's important for us in this moment, and in this nation, to actually look at how this is playing out in our politics and in our economics today. I know folks on this Zoom are familiar, have heard of the Heritage Foundation's 2025 Presidential Transition Project, otherwise known as Project 2025. I tend to think that it's almost like a Pax Romana of our day. In over 900 pages of like painstaking detail, the Heritage Foundation outlines this, expansive blueprint for a next administration. And what we know about the relationship of Project 2025 to who's behind it is it's funded and it's authored, and it's supported by a number of important Christian nationalist organizations. And so we see happening in our society today and in this election cycle, really a debate, a discussion going on about what future we're trying to live in this country and in this world. And Project 2025 lays out a vision of kind of wholesale state capture, couched in this kind of religiously regressive worldview. And even though its authors are talking about being pro-working class and, using kind of a language of conservative populism, they're very quick to decry wokeism and wokeness, and to critique all kinds of elites. But what's really going on here is about wrestling even greater control of people and resources into the hands of a small minority of mostly white and wealthy Christians. And I think part of why I'm thinking about this and the urgency of this moment is that in those 900 pages, 400 of them focus on things like the general welfare, getting rid of public education, cutting back the departments of agricultural and health and human services and HUD, eliminating popular programs like Head Start and Housing First, attacking and curtailing abortion and reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights, having kind of a anti-democratic and militarized form of governance, and spreading this kind of hate and lie across the country and world. And this brings me then to what I maybe most appreciated about the Crisis of Christian Nationalism in this book, because what the authors suggest the antidote to Christian nationalism is jubilee, is the flourishing of kind of human lives and community in relationship to the flourishing of the earth. And thinking about that kind of immortal trumpet blast of liberation that's echoed down through the ages, and taught us about, how God desires us to live. There really couldn't be something more polemical with or more different from the vision of white Christian nationalism today and of Project 2025. But if we continue to concede theology, and if we continue to concede people, the populace, to these forces, this political movement that would kind of do away with everything that Jesus cares so much about, I would say we don't just risk, the lives lost and hurt by such politics and provisions, but we also, give up God and Christianity to the Caesars of our day. I think it's not an accident that right before Jesus comes to his hometown and preaches Jubilee, he is tempted by the trappings of nationalism and militarism and the control of resources in that temptation. And so I think, and the devil in that temptation scene is quoting the Bible, is quoting scripture, much like those today quote the Bible to basically come out with something that is a complete and utter distortion of the liberatory power of Jubilee and these texts. And so I think there's a lot at stake. And I'm honored to then be in conversation with such forceful, powerful, and prophetic theologians, and priests and bishops who don't think that we get to do that conceding, but instead call out this sin of Christian nationalism and then organize ourselves out of it, so that we can actually be true to a God of justice who calls us to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God. So thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Theo Harris. And I'm so glad that you did raise sort of the issues of, through the lens of a biblical scholar, just in terms of Bible. And just as a preview, a lot of the questions that have been coming in have been sort of the biblical basis. How do we respond? And we'll get to that, right? But it is so important and for this larger conversation. Let's turn now to Canon Douglas, just in terms of the moment that we're in here, and also just your work on this report and just any reflections that you might have about that.
So
Yes.
I'll get off mute. First I want to thank you, Reverend Dr. Chang, for moderating this discussion, as well as for your gracious introduction. And really, it is a privilege, and I'm humbled to be here in this conversation with all of you. The question of why is it important to talk about Christian nationalism today? What's the urgency? In short, I could say because Christian nationalism is not benign. It is not a benign ideology. It is not a benign political project. It is not a benign religious or theological project. Christian nationalism has significant political, social, and cultural implications for who we are as a nation, who we are as people, and for who we are as church. So what are we talking about here? According to one of the most recent surveys by Public Religion and Research Institute, 1/3 of American people are considered adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalist ideals and ideology, to Christian nationalism. I'm going to get back to that 1/3 in a minute, because you've heard both Bishop Shin and Dr. Theo Harris speak of how it's a growing and expanding movement. I'll get to that, but 1/3, right? Yet what we know is that almost 2/3 of those who would consider themselves white evangelical Protestants are either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, right? We also know that almost 2/3 of one of our major political parties would also identify as Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, again, according to most recent survey by PRRI. Now, that means, so we can sort of see that in our public landscape, because while only 1/3 of Americans would be considered adherents or sympathizers, they hold, given their demographic in terms of white evangelical Protestantism or major political party, they hold an outsized presence on our public square. They are controlling our public political narrative in disproportionate way compared to their numbers. Here's another thing you need to know. Why is it important and why it's not benign? An even more recent study or survey by PRRI has shown that those Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers, something we can see, are also much more likely to also believe and support authoritarianism and authoritarian policies and politics. I think it's almost some 82%. We also know that Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers are more likely, and this is the 82% of Christian nationalists, to suggest or to believe that our America is in danger of losing its culture and its identity. Related to that, right, is the fact that, again, 6 of 10 Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers also believe that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. Christian nationalism is not benign. It is dangerous with severe political, cultural, and social implications. And as I talk about those numbers and the beliefs that are intrinsic to this Christian nationalist movement, what we can see, because we know what's going on in our politics today, right? What we can see is the outsized influence that it has on our public square, on our culture, on our presumed values. It is also, so I'll leave that, I'll leave that there. And when we talk about, I'll say more about what we mean by Christian nationalism, right? In our sort of next round. But what we do know is that the sort of political architecture and framework has been there for it. And the theological framework has been there, architecture has been there for it in terms of Christianity and in terms of American identity. I'll talk about that later, right? And so it's no accident that it's going to emerge unless we deal with the roots of this kind of thing. But why is it important for the Episcopal Church to take on this issue of Christian nationalism? And I think it is important for the Episcopal Church of all churches, and it's urgent because the Episcopal Church has a legacy of being the church, a history and a legacy of being the church of the wealthy slave-owning class, right? It has the legacy. I often say we aren't the complicit in slave-holding religion. We aren't complicit in the sort of colonizing and colonization. We are almost the progenitors of it, theologically and religiously. And so we have an uneasy history and relationship to white elite power and wealth. And so we have an outsized responsibility to begin to speak to a sort of religious political movement, social movement that indeed provides a sort of sacred canopy, uses Christianity as a sacred canopy to legitimate this kind of dominating elitist white power, because the Episcopal Church has this uneasy history with it. And so we are even more compelled to lead the way. It's a part of our obligation to continue to live into what it means to be church, even as we live over and against the sin of our own history as we've tried to aspire to become church. So I want to leave it there for now and sort of circle back to my first statement, opening statement, that Christian nationalism as a movement and as an ideology is not benign and is a danger to who we are as a nation, a people, and a church.
Thank you so much, Canon Douglas, and for the important reminder that it is not benign, and especially just pointing out why, as Episcopalians or people, sort of that are, sort of our allies, it's important to think about that. And I think also about the Anglican Communion, right, and the Church of
That's
England,
right.
that is an established church, right? So I look forward to sort of additional conversations. Bishop Hyde, so speaking of the Episcopal Church and your episcopacy and just how important this topic has been from your perspective, just would love to hear a little bit about your views on the importance of speaking out about this at this time, and also, the report of the House of Bishops Theology Committee.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cheng. The question is, what gospel do we seek to proclaim? And what civil society do we hope to shape? Canon Douglas spoke so powerfully about the difficult history of the Episcopal Church tangled up with white supremacy in America. And we see that the current moment has a long history and comes from someplace deep, both within the church and in our country. And the crisis of Christian nationalism calls both those things out plainly and clearly. I want to say, and I'm local and parochial, that we also have within our history the struggle towards a more perfect union. Those words are actually written by an Episcopalian who comes from the Diocese of New York. And so alongside us being tangled up in the structure of white supremacy and being part of a colonizing church, we have sought with our better angels to struggle towards what we aspire to, the values of John Locke, the dignity of every person. And so we've not had perfect leaders, but we've worked towards that perfect union. And we see that in the church and in the world. The folks from New York who we know, the Roosevelts, Pauli Murray, Thurgood Marshall, who have helped us to live into these aspirations. And so as much as we see so clearly in our history the lineage of white Christian nationalism, we also see the possibility of another way, of a different path, and one which remains for us to forge ahead with today. So there's another way to go to proceed from ideology which sells out the gospel to cheap partisanship, or alternatively, a retreat from the public square, neither of which is faithful. We have the opportunity for the Jubilee that the book describes and Dr. Theo Harris mentioned earlier this evening. The Jubilee, which is an expansive gospel of liberation that comes from the proclamation of Jesus Christ and lives in our communities and our neighborhoods wherever we are. And so 3 points. The first is this. Part of the sin of Christian nationalism is everything is degraded to partisan politics. Everything becomes this corrosive debate, which leaves nothing untouched or nothing untainted. Every day in the Diocese of New York, at our best, and across, I think, all of our communities, we have congregations that are welcoming people from all backgrounds. We see this beloved community, at least in its aspirations. We are made to belong, and we're made to welcome. And at our best in Christian community, we can be that and demonstrate that to the rest of the world. And so not to lose the character of deep love and deep belonging that is meant to be ours, that's our gift across generations, if we understand it and if we work towards it. The second is we are better and stronger together. We are a stronger church when we're in the public square with different belief systems, different faiths, different points of view, and working together towards a realized vision of human dignity for everybody. History tells us, we see in the current world, we do not do well when one ideology, when one theology dominates the rest. That is not healthy. It never has been. And so to be in conversation with different faiths and different backgrounds, I think enables us to more strongly understand who we are and to more healthily relate to other communities in the current public square. And the third comes directly from Canon Douglas, which is we yearn for reconciliation. We hear that in the polls. We want to be unity. We want to be together, right? But the reconciliation we should seek is reconciliation towards justice. That who we are as children of God, we cannot compromise or give up. We have to realize as we have these conversations in the public square, the conversations aren't and do not feel safe for many people in our communities. They are not theoretical. They are not things we watch on TV. They are things which affect families and communities across Diocese of New York and across our country. They are real. People's lives are at stake. And so as we seek to be in community together, we cannot give up the movement towards justice, which means the continued struggle to dismantle white supremacy, to move forward in recognizing everyone as a beloved child of God, and to being part of building communities that recognize and do that in our neighborhoods, in all of our neighborhoods. In these conversations we want with people of different backgrounds, we cannot give up parts of our baptismal covenant. We simply cannot. That is not faithful either. So as we seek to relate, as we become communities together, that we have to know that Jesus gives us a goal, which is new life and new life here. And we build towards that, even though, as in past generations, we will not achieve it in our lifetimes. But we work and try and relate to each other. Now, I see that in the welcome that our communities make across New York, and I know folks joining see that in their communities as well. Whether it's a movement towards reparations for slavery, which recognizes our past and what we do today to dismantle white supremacy, whether it's the movement towards helping our buildings and our communities recognize creation care as core to our theology, so recognizing climate change is real, or whether it's welcoming folks from all over the world in New York, welcoming asylum seekers has become the ministry of so many of our congregations, even it's become a hot political issue everywhere. We know because we experience it in each other in the embodied love of God and the incarnation of Jesus Christ in our communities, in our neighborhoods, what we're called to do. And it's proclaim a different gospel than the one that white Christian nationalism urges upon us, and to be engaged in the public square in a way different than the degraded partisan ways that we see so prevalent in our country today. I am grateful to Bishop Shin and the Theology Committee, grateful for the resource that this book will be, and for the conversation we're having tonight.
Thanks very much, Bishop Hyde. And I'm really struck by this idea of not giving up or not abdicating our responsibility within the public square. And I think this webinar is a great example of how we can do this. So thank you all of the panelists for your initial reflections and statements. And for those of you that may have come a little bit late, what we're going to do is we're going to just follow up with a few rounds of questions, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. Given sort of the number of participants, we're not going to be able to call on people in terms of raising hands. So I would just encourage you to please use the Q&A box to put in your questions. And even sort of, I think we're up to 37 questions. So given the time of this, I will do my best to synthesize the questions and to sort of, come up with themes. But we'll get to that in a second. I think, the first question I had is, one of the things that I did see in some of the questions is just, let's go to sort of 101, right? Christian Nationalism 101. Like, the number of people here, some maybe really, have spoken or even written about this, but there may be others who have just stumbled into this, right? Or might just be wondering, like, how do you define this? Several people said that, right? And also, how does one make it personal? So the first question is just sort of how would you define this, and within the broader umbrella of sin, if you like, also. But then also, more importantly, how has it affected you personally, right? We talk about sort of, our faith, in terms of the Bible and theology, is really telling stories, right? And so I'd invite you to sort of not only define Christian nationalism, but also just, maybe give us an example of a time in your life where you did realize that this is not only important, but this is sinful from your perspective. So let's start with Dr. Theo Harris in terms of all the good work that you've done in the Kairos Center on this question.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm just loving this whole conversation. To me, the part of how I help define or try to begin a definition of Christian nationalism is by kind of pulling out a few of the key beliefs that kind of animate it. So I think I might say that there's like 6 or 7 or 8 things that I think are really important, and I'm really welcoming of people adding to this. And but I think the first is that kind of modern day Christian nationalism, states that the kind of a highly exclusionary form of Christianity is the only true religion. And then connects it quickly to the fact that like the nation has to be ruled by this exclusionary form of Christianity, and that the kind of separation of church and state is actually an anti-Christian idea and actually has to be undermined. I think the third kind of thing I would say is a key belief that kind of animates Christian nationalism in the United States today is about white supremacy, and how white supremacy, along with patriarchy and heteronormativity, is the natural order of the world, and it's about upholding white supremacy in personal lives as well as in kind of public, kind of social ways. I think there's also this kind of question or issue of militarism and violence, kind of rather than democratic expression or diplomacy as the kind of the right way for the government to exert power, both domestically and globally. That this is kind of a violent manifestation. Then there's kind of the idea that scarcity is the kind of economic reality of life. And so whether it's Americans versus the world, or Christians versus non-Christians, or white people versus people of color, or natural-born citizens versus immigrants, and the list goes on and on and on, have to kind of compete for resources. And the notion that everyone could thrive, and not just struggle to survive, like is just out there. I think the next kind of key belief that I would talk about kind of is folks that are seeing themselves oppressed by systemic violence are the very people that Christian nationalists blame for kind of deep social and economic problems in the world. Whether it's the poor are at fault for their poverty, or LGBTQ plus folk are responsible for kind of disease or social rupture, that documented and undocumented immigrants are, called rapists and murderers, and are stealing, so-called American jobs. And just like it keeps going and going, right? And then I think another key component is also then where kind of my story comes in, which is that the Bible is kind of the source of moral authority on these and other issues. But when we get to there, and again, this is how it's kind of played out in my life. I mean, both as someone who has experienced poverty, the lack of healthcare, the lack of housing, my own self, and have been organizing amongst poor and low income communities for 3 decades. We have a very distorted notion of what the Bible says, and so instead of preach good news to those who have been made poor by kind of injustice, we have all of these notions of like there's not enough to go around, or robbing Peter to pay Paul, or you should go get a job. And all the ways that the Bible and kind of religion have been used, and weaponized to justify that 800 people die every day in the richest country in the world from poverty and inequality, and millions across the world. And there is really a direct connection in my own experience and in my own life about the kind of wholesale capture of the country, and the punishing of the poor and unhoused by Christian nationalists. And so I think I have gotten tired of every week, every couple of days in my life, someone using the Bible to justify exactly the kinds of things that are actually considered wrong in the eyes of God and in the words of Jesus. And so I that's how it shows up for me.
Thank you, Dr. Thea Harris. Ken and Douglas, you spent your life teaching people at all levels, and this year at Harvard Divinity School. What would you say, and how would you define this for someone who might not be as familiar with it, and how, was there a moment in your life that you sort of realized about the sinfulness of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, thank you. I think the way in which I've come to understand Christian nationalism, and in this respect, for me, it's nothing new. It just continues to manifest itself in different ways in different periods of time. And so for me, Christian nationalism is about two narratives coming together that are a part of our history as a nation, and a narrative that is a part of our wider Christian, if you will, tradition. The first narrative that many of you have already spoken to is this narrative of white supremacy that is in the DNA, the founding DNA of this nation. And that is a narrative which suggests, right, that in fact it equates American citizenship with whiteness, with whiteness. And white supremacy goes on to the various systems and structures and ideologies and realities of white supremacy to protect white privilege, right? So we have, without going into all the sort of historical realities and emergence of white supremacy, we have white supremacy, and then we have this religious narrative that comes together with it. And this religious narrative is has been one of the prevailing narratives that have been a part of our nation's founding of Christianity, that equates Christianity with power. And the narrative of Christianity that provides, as I suggested before, a legitimating sacred canopy, religious canopy that legitimates now white supremacy. We have seen this. We've always had a theological religious narrative. We can say that it's bad theology. I'll get to that in a second. that has legitimated white supremacist power. And we can talk about that as slaveholding religion. There was a version of Christianity that legitimated and justified slavery. This is the history out of which our contemporary version of Christian nationalism has emerged. We can trace this back. We say, well, how in the world did we get there? I mean, we hear Dr. Theo Harris talking in Bishop Hyde saying in Bishop Shin that this isn't Christianity, this isn't the gospel. Well, how do we get here? There's something going on here. And it seems to me, and I talked about this, it's in the book as Bishop Shin knows, that what we saw, sort of the beginning of this kind of legacy, where Christianity begins to legitimate power, is Constantine's conversion. When Christianity became the religion of the state, when Christianity became the religion of the empire, when, as one Christian theologian, James Carroll said, when the cross became a sword. So what indeed any version of Christianity like Christian nationalism, and we've got, if we're honest about it, we've got to call it white Christian nationalism. Got to be clear about that. This is one of the debates on our theological commission, and we couldn't quite get to the white, but it's white Christian nationalism because it takes into account this collusion between white supremacy and Christianity. That is Christian nationalism, the manifestation of Christian nationalism in this country. It is white Christian nationalism, and it's what whiteness does when we think of it. I'm not talking about people who happen to look like white Americans or white people. Whiteness as a social racial construct. It's what it does. Whiteness, as it reflects power, it corrupts Christianity. It turns the cross on its head. And so in Christian nationalism, the cross becomes a sword, when in fact, the cross that we know that is at the center of our faith signals God's utter solidarity with the subjugated, oppressed, and marginalized classes of people in the world. What the cross does is lets us know clearly, if we got it confused before, it clearly says to us that if we want to understand the meaning of justice, we can only do that from the vantage point of the crucified classes of our society, in our world, from those on the underside of justice. White Christian nationalism turns the cross on its head and suggests that the meaning of justice is linked to subjugating, dominating, oppressive power. And we know that is let's just say anti-cross, anti-Christ. So that's one of some so the white Christian nationalism is the collusion of white supremacy with a prevailing narrative that uses the Christian faith as a sacred canopy over that kind of power. Then I'll just quickly say, so you asked, when did I first become when did it become real for me? I really can't, Reverend Dr. Chang, I can't remember when it wasn't real. I probably didn't call it Christian. I didn't call it Christian nationalism. But I always say I'm 67 years old and have been Black for 67 years. And at least 62 of those years I've known I'm Black. And with that recognition of navigating this world, which is always, and navigating this society, which is always claimed to be a Christian society in some way, but navigating and like really, and with all of the ways in which I've had to navigate Blackness in this society, I've always been aware that there has been a Christian tradition that negates my humanity. And that's the stuff that white Christian nationalism is made of. It's oppositional. It negates the humanity of many of God. It does not appreciate and respect the sacred humanity of all of God's creation, because it is oppositional, it's intrinsically oppositional, intrinsically either or. It intrinsically always dehumanizes the other, the non-white other, however that category is defined.
Thank you, Ken and Douglas, and thank you again for the reminder of can't just take out strands. It's intersectional, and especially with respect to race and ethnicity. Bishop Hyde, just in terms of a definition and or just a moment that this has really struck you as being sinful.
Well, it simply is, as described, white Christian nationalism makes the gospel hostage to a degraded politics and a degraded public square, and disempowers our faith in ways that is not what I think the best of our tradition calls us to do. Today is the feast day of Saint Teresa of Avila, and we see across many generations how, in fact, the Christian faith has both renewed itself within community and engaged the world to critique the wider power structure. Saint Teresa did that, and we can too. So to be engaged without being captured, I think is an important strand of our tradition and our call right now. I mean, I grew up in the American South, and so have been aware since I was small, both discrimination and the power of wider civil society and of religion to reinforce white supremacy. The thing that surprised me is I thought that was a Southern issue. And you move to the North and find it is an American issue. It is in all of our communities. The thing that surprises me in this last season is that now we're saying the quiet part out loud, is that people of faith and our leaders say the things I thought were whispered only, and now they're saying it out loud about legitimating discrimination. Something like 58% of Americans now believe in the mass deportation of immigrants, which is a dramatic change over the last decade. And, New York City, the place where I live, is majority foreign born in this or the last generation, and has been our strength for forever when we choose to observe it as such. And so to not see our faith taken hostage to this degraded Christianity, to see us in dialogue with the wider power structures, and for us to say out loud what's wrong, and that the explicit proclamation of discrimination and exclusion is not our faith and not meant to be our civil society.
Thank you, Bishop Hyde. Bishop Shin, in terms of your work with the committee and, in terms of thinking about the definition or your own the personal impact of white Christian nationalism on you, please share with us what you've been thinking.
Christian nationalism, I think, is anti-gospel. It's not a gospel at all. Jesus preached peacemaking, love, justice, and mercy as the good news. Christian nationalism teaches conflict, hatred, fear, violence, militarism, all the things that are just absolutely against what we believe to be gospel, the good news. Christian nationalism, I think, is seductive news for those select few, mostly white, who live in white male patriarchy. It is bad news for everybody else. So it cannot be the good news of Jesus Christ. Christian nationalism for me is Dr. Douglas, who talked about white supremacy, the intersection of white supremacy and race being the foundation of Christian nationalism. It is modern form of how white supremacy has morphed over centuries. White supremacy began with Western colonialism in the modern day, colonialism of the rest of the world. And then they said, well, we discovered America. The people who were living, the native indigenous people, were not people at all. They were animals. And of course, then what happened out of that white supremacy then morphed into racializing other people based on skin color. And so on. It continues to morph in a system to survive and to be maintained. And Christian nationalism is a current form of how to maintain the white supremacy in our system and in our structure, in our society. So it is in that sense, it's a terrible, really bad ideology to begin with. But how is it is an idolatry? It's a sin because and Dr. Theoharis alluded to earlier, in the temptation of Christ, and I talk about it in the book also in the introduction part. The devil quotes scripture and says to Jesus, "This entire world, whole kingdom is yours if you bow to me." Right? And you turn away from God and bow to me, I'll give you everything, all the power in the world, and the whole thing is yours. That's exactly the parallel to the seduction of white Christian nationalism. That it is only Christian in name only. It is not real. It's bad. Not only bad, it's just not even religion at all. To serve the ideological goal of maintaining the power structure of white supremacy. So I define Christian nationalism really as an idolatry. It's an idolatry of white supremacists, white supremacy, and using Christian religion as a justification for it. And so fundamentally, it's a sin of idolatry and apostasy, as far as I can tell. And that's how I would define Christian nationalism from a theological point of view. I guess I've always, like many, I've always been aware of sort of white nationalism, as I said earlier, and aware of sort of seeing images of Ku Klux Klan groups marching with a cross. It was really odd, but it really hit me more recently in the January 6th, 2021 insurrection, but also other recent movements where they co-opt the central symbol of peace, justice, and mercy, the cross, as a symbol of violence and oppression. If there is actually existential crisis for the church, actually it is the rise of the Christian nationalism. If we don't stand up, if the church does not stand up against and speak up against this rise of Christian nationalism, I think in the end, the church will die. That is what will happen, because it has co-opted the cross, the Bible, the religion, the name of the Christianity, to justify the devil's kingdom, the Satan's kingdom. And that'll be the end, actually, of the church. So it is urgent that we stand up and speak up against this.
Great. Thank you so much, Bishop Shin. Well, what a great conversation. Let's get into the second question, and then we'll have the third, and then we'll have some Q&A. As a theologian, an important part of doing theology is really sort of acknowledging one's own social location, right? Like anybody that won't acknowledge sort of how social location along with other sort of the Bible and church history and reason, it's key. And so what I'd like to ask the panelists is just how is your own social location, in terms of your ecclesial or other location shaped your response to white Christian nationalism? And perhaps this can also just help other people reflect upon their own social locations. Uh, Ken Douglas, as a scholar, canon theologian, um, how have you used your positionality in terms of your teaching, writing, and preaching? And you've covered some of this already, but just circle back.
Thank you, and so I'll be brief. I think I guess I should begin by saying that in all of those spaces, whether as a theologian in the academy teaching, whether as an Episcopal priest, as I've been for 41 years now, or as working at the cathedral, that what I'm aware of, what's central for me is not those positions, so to speak, but it's who I am as a child of God. And I try to take seriously, as we all do, what it means to be a child of God, created in God's own image. I see that as a fact, but I also see it as a call and a challenge. It is a fact that we are that. God calls us God's children. It's not a fact that we live into what that means. And so in all of those spaces that I have been really privileged in the little garden of the world in which God has allowed me to live, I've tried to advocate for what it means for all of us to be children of God. And in so doing, living into what that means for myself. So what does that Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, is a challenge to that? It defies the sacredness of God's creation. In this instance, more particularly in this instance, God's human creation. So I try to teach about it. I write about it. It's and try to teach about what it means, to live into who we are as children of God, and to respect the sacred humanity of all persons. And don't do it perfectly. So in my imperfect self, just continue to aspire to who God has called us to be as God's own children. And that begins with respecting the sacred humanity of others. And it is only when we do that that we respect our sacred humanity. That's the foundation. And it's what compels me, even when I don't know what to say, to stand up against anything that would in any way violate that sacred humanity and help other people to understand the roots of that, and to understand that it's a violation of all of our humanity. And for those of us who are Christian, it's a violation of our faith. And it's certainly a violation of God's very creation.
Thank you, Ken and Douglas. Bishop Hyde, as a diocesan bishop, and before that, just a leader in the national church, how does your social location inform your view of the sin of Christian nationalism?
Well, I'm an organizer, and the work of the church happens locally across our local communities, congregations and chaplaincies and schools. And the ministry of a bishop is to support our local communities, not only to be vibrant expressions of the gospel in their own community, but to be out in their neighborhoods. And that's what we're trying to do. We believe that this moment is one of renewal For the church, which means flourishing and struggle at the same time, it absolutely means change and restructuring ourselves for the present moment. And we do that because we were called to participate in God's healing of the world. And we do that with partners in all of our neighborhoods and to continue to seek where the Spirit is moving and calling us at this moment. We have 12 languages spoken in congregations across the Diocese of New York. We have 100 languages spoken in neighborhoods across the Diocese of New York. And so we have the opportunity to continue to reach out and learn and be changed by the people whom we welcome and meet, by the communities in which we live, and are called to both preach the gospel and receive the Spirit. And so it's joy. I mean, we've all described what we see, and maybe many of us here tonight see, as the crisis of this moment. But the crisis of this moment presents an opportunity for the church, and to see it exactly as such. We know that what we preach, what we do, makes a difference. And at this moment in our history, feels like big history, is important to do exactly that across our communities.
Thank you, Bishop Hyde. And the Holy Spirit does work on ground level, right? Bishop Shin, just as a leader, as the chair of the House of Bishops Theology Committee, and sort of your own work in theology, how does that location shape your views?
So I guess I begin with my social location, if you will, or cultural location as an Asian immigrant myself. I've been in this country 52 years now, so I'm sufficiently mainstream Americanized, if you will. But I'm still, there's a part of me that still identifies with that sense of being an immigrant. And the issues that face, especially in recent years, the challenges that immigrants face in the political landscape of this nation now, really touches me in the deep core, just because I identify with those immigrants who are struggling in this social and political era. So that's one place. The other place, of course, is the privilege of being in an ordained ministry, both as a priest and now as a bishop. And I call it privilege because it is a great location and a place of responsibility. Because privilege always comes with responsibility, and the responsibility is to preach the gospel of love of Jesus Christ crucified and risen. Nothing else, really. The great Bishop John Henry Hobart, who was bishop in the 1820s, in his deathbed, gave said to his the priest who was caring for him, and what was the one last wisdom would you give me? He says, always preach Christ crucified. If you do not have that, if you do not have that in your sermon, then that sermon has no power. It is not a good sermon. And we have kind of, at the church, I think, forgotten that. We have no other story. We have no other story to tell but the story of Jesus Christ crucified and risen. And all that because of love, nothing else, no other reason. And it's sacrificial love, and that love is sacrificial, and that love is unconditional, has absolutely no condition attached to it. And it is never ending, it's eternal. And it is that we have to trust, have faith in that power, the power of that story to transform and heal our divisions and brokenness in our society, because it has done so again and again and again in its 2,000-year history. And if you remember in Acts 2, had this great Pentecost event and everybody's all amazed and all that stuff. What does Peter do? Peter gets up and speaks, and he tells the story of Jesus. And in that instant, and then Acts 2 tells us that in that instant, 3,000 people were converted, were transformed, right? That's the part we have to remember. It was the first time the story of Jesus was ever told in public post-resurrection. And that's the beginning. That is how the church began, by preaching and proclaiming and telling the story of Jesus Christ, crucified and risen for no other reason than love. That's it. And we must do whatever we talk about, whatever we say, it is that. And that, I believe, has the power to withstand and stand against the Christian nationalism ideology and its movement. We must have faith in that. And so that's where I leave. And, it's very, very hard for anybody to argue against love, I think. There's especially when that love is absolutely sacrificial, unconditional, and never-ending, as that of Jesus Christ crucified.
Thank you, Bishop Shin. And your comments really resonated with me as someone who is a first-generation immigrant to this country as well. Dr. Theo Harris, as a minister, teacher, activist, executive director of a nonprofit, could you say some things about how your social location shapes your views?
I really appreciate this question because this kind of big evil sin of white Christian nationalism plays out in all of our lives in our social locations, right? So I'm a white woman, a Christian woman, a mom, a daughter and granddaughter of survivors of genocide, of disability, of undocumented immigration. All of those things come to play. But like Bishop Hyde was saying, I'm also an organizer. And I travel across the United States. And I'm constantly in communities that are beset by climate chaos. And the first folk on the scene are Christian nationalists. Communities where the kind of industry is left and the church is left, except for Christian nationalists. Communities where, politicians haven't been there in decades, and who is, showing up with food and a heretical theology are Christian nationalists. I think that that's where I have come to see this crisis, this sin, but it's also where I've come to see that it doesn't have to be this way, and that people of faith from different faith traditions, at the same time as Christian nationalists are taking over the schools and taking over the history books and denying that climate change is a reality, and endangering, therefore, the lives of LGBTQ and women and all young people, and for sure Black people and Indigenous people and immigrants. Folk are coming together across all of these different lines that divide us, and saying there is no equal sign between kind of extremism and Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism and the kind of society that we want to live in. And so I get great hope from that. That on the one hand, I feel like I'm in many of the ground zeros of Christian nationalism these days, but it's also from many of those communities that I'm meeting folks that are, mainline Protestants and Episcopals and Presbyterians. I'm meeting, low-wage workers, and I'm meeting, young environmental activists who all are very clear that we can build a different world. And many of those, from a faith perspective, saying, that this is that this is, in Paul's words, anathema, and that this is not the good news, the gospel, but actually another, not good news, that instead, is a threat to people's life and livelihood, and therefore, as a people of faith, like we have to resist and organize and do something better. And we can't just kind of tear down the heresy and the sin of this theology and ideology, but we can actually build the kinds of communities where hundreds of folks are figuring out how to feed and clothe and house themselves, and where thousands of people are saying, we're going to make this place somewhere that's about love and inclusion and hope for everybody. And so I feel very lucky, from my social location, to like be able to see that and be a part of that, and to see that something better is possible.
Thank you, Dr. Thea Harris. So we're in the home stretch. We've talked about, just in terms of our own stories and social locations, a lot of the questions have to do with, what do we do about this, right? Like, it's one thing to, maybe, teach at a fancy seminary or have an ecclesial position, but how can, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, in your view, how can people make a difference in their own lives and wherever they are, right? And Bishop Hyde, you've been encouraging people in the diocese to have conversations about this, with the Hobart lecture recently with the Reverend Dr. Carter Hayward, and Dr. Hayward's book, The Seven Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism. Could you say a little bit more about, if someone came to you and would like to know what they can do about this?
Well, the first thing is take care of yourself. This is, as we've talked about tonight, come from long history and active organizing. And so both dismantling the current white Christian nationalism as it is, and trying to build, as Dr. Theo Harris said so powerfully, a different community, a Jubilee community, will take time. And so take care of yourself. This season has felt to so many like slow motion trauma. Now, that's been true for communities of color, for clergy of color, for people of color, for forever, but even for them, it's become more intense. And so we can't engage in the work if we don't take care of ourselves and seek to take care of those around us. And then to keep finding ways to engage, to relentlessly engage out in our neighborhoods, in our communities. So many of us are called just to be present with each other, to be present to the moment, and to model a different way. And for so many in our communities, it's not safe to engage right now, and to recognize that too, and to try to do in each of our small ways to change the landscape so it becomes a safer place for those around us, because it feels and is profoundly unsafe right now. And so by our engagement, by our seeking to engage others, I think we can make it a bit safer and begin to both dismantle and rebuild a different kind of beloved community in all of our neighborhoods. Finally, the best way to engage is to listen to each other's stories, to really hear each other. And we all described social location, to hear where people are, what their experiences have been, what their hopes are. As Bishop Shin said so powerfully, our story is Christ crucified, the gospel of Jesus Christ. We see and experience that in our communities through each other's stories. And so care for ourselves, care for each other, engage, help make it safer for others to engage, and to listen carefully to where Jesus lives within our communities and with our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Bishop Hyde, for the pastoral words. And one of the questions had to do with courage and fear and just even being out there, right, during these charged times. Bishop Shin, just in terms of some thoughts about what people can do, and I suspect it may revolve around the report, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, certainly. Report talks about the community organizing and building relationships in the local community. And it needs to be done locally. It's a national issue, and some level it is a global issue. But we can only do this work and any justice work really locally, engaging with local communities. And I have to say, in my travel around our diocese anyway, I see a lot of churches actually are doing it in their own way. The feeding those who need, food pantries, serving their community who are in need, hanging up LGBTQ flag in the church front. I mean, that is actually a statement, isn't it? A statement that stands against some aspect of Christian nationalism. But just being, and as Bishop Hyde said, engaging with the community in a way that lifts up the goodness of humanity, and sharing the good news of Christian gospel, Christian message. I think that's really most important, rather than beating down those who disagree or trying to force conversation with people who don't want to have conversations. I think you don't want to do that. Always be ready to have a conversation, however, because it is through conversations that conversion of heart can happen. So I would say always be ready to have the necessary conversations, which is a two-way street. I'm just really heartened by many of our churches. We have a small church up in Catskills in Ulster County, in a small town. And the priest there told me when I visited one time, he said, this Episcopal Church, small Episcopal Church, is the only progressive presence in this entire neck of the wood. And 30 miles up the road is a KKK meeting house. And they're doing it. They're living into the gospel in their own way. They're not being loud about it, but in their practice, they're living out the gospel by feeding the hungry, by clothing the naked, and they have a prison ministry there. People go work and visit all that stuff, the stuff that Jesus declared in Luke chapter 4, right? His mission. They're living into that, and that's really is the best subversive way of standing up against movements such as Christian nationalism. I think in our local way, and also I would say clergy oftentimes are put on spot because they're public figure, and as Bishop Hyde said, I think first take care of yourself and be careful when you are in certain environments and situations. However, have a clarity about where the line is drawn in the sand when it comes to Christian nationalism. You just have to be very clear about, once you have that clarity of we are about the good news of Jesus Christ crucified and risen. And that is non-negotiable, no matter what happened, no matter what. In our preaching, in our living, in our practice, in our discipleship, in our vocation. And so that's really what I would say. I think a lot of members of our church, actually all over the place, are actually doing this, and I want to lift that up. It's not something extra or special. We're already doing the work. It's just that we need to do it. We need to do it really with much more clarity and a deeper reflection. Okay.
Thank you, Bishop Shen. Dr. Thea Harris, thoughts about what people can do in their own lives and locations?
Well, I do want to amen Bishop Shin's reminder that people are doing amazing work right now in your context and your communities. So chances are many of the folks that are on in this conversation could tell us what to do because people are doing it. I have two things to also offer. One is an invitation. If there are folks connected to congregations out there that are looking for more resources and more engagement and more training in addressing white Christian nationalism, the Cairo Center is actually organizing a program, a pilot program with Surge Showing Up for Racial Justice that starts in 2025 and is looking for congregations that want, some level of kind of training and engagement and being a part of cohorts of your congregations that are working to address, this sin. So if people are interested, please reach out to the Cairo Center. But also, I want to put a plug out for a colleague of mine, an Episcopal leader, who has a book coming out also in 2025. The Aaron Scott, who is the new gender justice officer for the Episcopal Church nationally, has a book that's called Bring Back Your People, 10 Ways Regular Folks Can Put a Dent in White Christian Nationalism. And, it's funny and it's personal. And there are some stories there of Episcopalians like doing amazing work and also some very practical information. So next to the Crisis of Christian Nationalism, people could grab that book and get some really good advice.
Thank you, Dr. Thea Harris, for some very practical tips. Ken Douglas, your thoughts? And with the, I think you're on mute right now.
I tell you, I'm the person that should just keep it on all the time. But first, I just want to affirm everything that people have said because yes, to all of that, and just say very quickly two quick things. One, which is affirming people showing up. People. The question becomes, why are communities and people so vulnerable to such an ideology that is white Christian nationalism? And their vulnerability is typically their marginality, the ways in which they find themselves discounted and on the underside of justice. So we need to show up in the ways that we show up, right? Doing the work in the ways that we can do it in the little spot of the garden in which we have been given to tend and to live in. Meet the needs, show up doing justice. Then the other thing that I would say, well, let me add that and then I'll go to this last thing, which is one word. And what does that mean? People often ask, okay, what does that mean? That's hard to do. What's that look like? And we can't say, show up expressing your values. But what does it look like? And people have heard me say this before, and I try as imperfectly as I may do it to live into it. And that is, I always say, don't withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. If you want housing, decent housing, don't withhold it from another. If you want enough food to eat, don't withhold it from another. If you want to feel respected for who you are as a sacred human being and child, don't withhold that from another. Don't withhold from another that which you would not withhold from yourself, and then go about trying to create a community, a society, and a world that doesn't withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. And that becomes the way in which we can show up doing the gospel and fending off the ideology that is white Christian nationalism, which leads to the one last word that I will say. What can we do in this time in which we find ourselves? In response to white Christian nationalism, we can vote. Vote. And take 2 other people with you. Go vote.
Thank you, Canon Douglas. So we've got about 12 minutes left and 107 questions. So as our brilliant panel has been speaking, I've furiously been scrolling through the questions. One sort of observation is just the questions are like a microcosm of our larger society. There are some very supportive questions, there are some very divisive questions, and yet, but for the most part, we have covered a lot of things in terms of praxis, what can we do, definitions, and all that. One thing that I noticed, and I'll open it up to anyone who wants to answer, is that some questions about both sides of the Christian spectrum. On the one hand, people who use the Bible, right, like in terms of Protestantism and Reform, like how do you sort of talk that language? There are some other comments about being with our Roman Catholic siblings, right? And I think it's appropriate that the Episcopal Church and the Anglican tradition is born out of these two threads. But I just love to, if you had any comments, and I know in the book there are some, sort of sitting on the hill and just different ways of thinking about this. But, just in terms of how would you sort of use different forms of theological argument, like the Bible or church tradition, or just, sort of organizing among different in an ecumenical context. So I'll just open it up to whoever feels comfortable answering that.
I'll start with that. You can only be who you are, and you can only give authentic voice to from your own place of who you are. So it'll be disingenuous if I try to talk like an evangelical. It would be ridiculous. It would be probably not I would probably do a very good job to try to argue a Catholic Christian who is Christian nationalist and using Catholic tradition and language. It just wouldn't work. I can only do it from my perspective, from what I understand to be an Episcopal tradition and ethos. And what's nice, the nice thing about Episcopal tradition is that it kind of holds both, we call it via media, right? And is expansive and try to hold as much of different diversity of thoughts and opinions and traditions together, which is also advantage and disadvantage, I think. But I think of via media, the middle way and Anglican way, I think is actually a way that is actually incarnational and transformational. It's not a middle way of compromise. It's not a middle way of cowering to either extremes, but it's a way of that brings together diversity of our thoughts and diversity of who we are as human beings, as God's creatures, as bring them as incarnation as a body of Christ. So we all belong in the beloved community of Jesus, of the body of Christ. And that's incarnational aspect. And in that process, then, incarnation is transformation. In that process, actually, via media points toward transformation. It's not a compromise of opposing points of view. It's actually transformation of all. So that's for me, that helpful for me to think in those terms. And so if I'm, I don't have to talk evangelical language. I don't have to necessarily, I can quote the Bible, but that's not the point. Anybody can memorize verses of the Bible and regurgitate. It doesn't take a Christian to do that, actually. Just because you quote the Bible does not make you necessarily holy and righteous. Bible can be used as a weapon against oppressed other people. It has been. We've done that for many, many years. And so we should not, just because someone is talking in the evangelical language and a biblical literalist language, we shouldn't succumb to that. That is not necessarily that is not necessarily a position that we can cover, like succumb to. It's just not. That's not where I want to go. We can only do this from our position of who we are as Episcopal Christians.
Thank you, Bishop Shin. Others, in terms of just talking across denominational lines, or just using the Bible or other sources? Well, we can come back to this. Maybe another question that really, or comment that really struck me, as someone, I did my dissertation on the Karl Barth's doctrine of sin. So, but just in terms of neo-orthodoxy and the role of theologians like Barth and Niebuhr, and just, who, by the way, both warned against the dangers of equating the state with God, right? The no's on that. But I suppose just a question in terms of, sort of locating this within the larger theological tradition. And of course, liberation theologies, feminist, womanist theologies, queer theologies. Just wanted to open this up. We've already touched upon a lot of these, many of these themes, but just any reflections about sort of the broader theological tradition, the academy, and what we might do to continue to encourage these conversations.
Yeah, a big question. I think, it is about continuing these conversations. It is about, there was a commercial. I'm dating myself. Now there was a commercial when quote unquote instant soup came out, right? Lipton instant soup, right? Today people would say, what was so instant about that? Because you still had to put it in a pan and you still had to heat it up. But the tagline of that commercial would be a little boy playing outside in the snow, and he'd stick his head in and he'd say, "Is it soup yet?" Right? Here's what we know. We aren't at God's just future yet. We don't ask that question. That's not the theological question we have. Is it, are we there yet? The question we ask is how can I move us further? How can I live into the justice of God in the place where I find myself? Our task as theologians is to hold our faith traditions accountable to the call to the future that is God's just future, more just future. That's our task. And so it seems to me, no accident, or it's not incidental that the Theological Commission of the Episcopal Church would take up this topic of white Christian nationalism. And it is our first task is to hold ourselves accountable to our faith, right? And what we claim. That's the theological task. And so, so the academy, as you say, and the church should always be in this dialectical conversation with one another. And it should never, because that's the cross, it should never be divorced from the world. The cross itself is political. It's a difference between being political and it's political. And it is partisan. It's partisan on the side of those that are oppressed, fighting and moving toward justice. That's where justice has to begin. So we can't be afraid of these words. We can't be afraid of the P words of political and partisan. We can't. We've got to be political as God has been political. We have to be partisan as the cross is partisan. And move forward. The last thing I'll just say, and as you talk about Niebuhr in particular, Niebuhr was clear that as he wrote in The Irony, I think, of America, of American history, that this nation of ours was not going to, the biggest threat to it wasn't from sort of outside. The biggest threat to it was from the inside. And the biggest threat was from really our own hubris, that we believed it, in short, it could never happen to us. Our own hubris that our way was the way. That's Christian nationalism. And that this our way was the way, and that it would never crumble. And so this is where we find ourselves. And so our theological task is to push our church and all of us to respond to the crisis of the moment, as Bishop Hyde so eloquently said, God's crisis is our opportunity.
Thank you, Canon Douglas. I think this might be a really good place to leave things. Unless anyone else has any burning things to say, just wanted to really thank all of you for participating, the panelists, those of you that have signed up and spent the last 2 hours with us, and most of all, the staff of the Cairo Center and Church Publishing for all the work that they had done in terms of organizing and publicizing and making sure everything went well. So this webinar would not have happened without you. And I'm really hoping that as we reach the end, last things eschatology, that this is not the end, but the beginning of a series of conversations, of essential conversations. And so, encourage all of you to sort of inwardly digest what's been said and think about next steps. So thank you to all of you. Have a good night, and God bless. Okay, take care.